Thank you, Professor Brague, for this very interesting lecture. So I guess that we have many questions and we have time for it. So that's a good news. So please raise your hand and be sure that's a question and not a comment, please. Yes?
I'm sure it's a question. It's a recollection of 2 points that you made. The first one being that of that little point you made about Sartre and what he said about the poet that was biased in his nature about the observation. And as well the point that you made about that scribbling that someone wrote, that why bother asked that question. Do you not think that it could be a slight leap in one's line of reasoning to assume that if a side or a stance like theism poses a question that by its own nature is skewed, such that the other side need not bother to ask that question, to answer that question? In the sense that, you mentioned that Sartre, he said that why would you bother observing something when you are swayed, in the sense that a human might be swayed? Especially since you made a point in your lecture where you were indifferent towards a certain question of the decreasing birth rates. Why would we assume that that side is wrong? Why would we assume that there's a failure on behalf of that side, especially since you're aware that, for example, an atheist can ask a theist the question of, can God create a boulder too heavy to lift? The reason why we succeed in answering that as theists is we say, why bother to answer that question when its very nature defies the premise that we make for God, the definition that we set for God. So finally, my question is this. Why is a failure of a side to answer a question that by its own nature swayed a failure of that side in entirety?
Well, I'm awfully sorry that there are problems of acoustics. I understand perhaps every second word as far as I understood. Your question means, well, your question is a way, in my opinion, to reformulate the objection I've made to myself. Is, do we really need a reason to go on? Was this your point? Or perhaps not exactly.
The two sides that disagree on something have different.
Is that the microphone? I'm sorry.
If two sides disagree on something, sometimes it's because they have premises that negate each other. So, for example, an atheist would assume that there cannot possibly be a God, and a theist presumes a God by its definition, that if they ask a certain question like, why should we continue existing, its question basically is swayed in its nature, that if an atheist were to answer that question, they would have to have the same premises as the theist. But I'm saying, how can we make a question compatible to both sides that by their very nature are in opposition?
I'm not sure to have been able to go to the bottom of your question. Perhaps let me rephrase a point in my talk. And perhaps I'll begin with telling you a personal remembrance. Well, I was given the opportunity to discuss this question. I was given the opportunity to discuss this question with a person whom I need not name, but it's rather well known. I was surprised. He defines himself as secular, if it's the new idiom, instead of the Victorian equivalence of theism, like agnosticism, humanism, and so on. Now, secularism is Victorian too, by the way. It was launched by Holy Hoke in the 60s. He understands himself as a staunch supporter. But let's take this fellow as a human type. That the name is irrelevant here. Let's say a staunch supporter of the Enlightenment, who understands him or herself as secular, and who answers an objection of the same kind, like the one I've just been making, is atheism by saying, well, nature will do that, why shouldn't we leave nature do what she wants, metaphorically speaking? I was really surprised to have to listen from the lips of such a person this kind of argument, which defeats the search for arguments, which is the usual ploy of Enlightenment thinkers. How can you justify what you are doing? Let's think of the revolutionaries, and first of all, of the people who were the intellectual harbingers of the revolution in France. How is it that there is a king? There must be a reason for a member of this family to be king, not anybody else, and so on. When we look for reasons, we have to be able to give good reason. It's almost a tautology. A reason must always be a good reason. A bad reason is no reason at all. And how should we leave the care for the survival of the human species to such a mythical figure as nature? Why should we give up the search for reasons where what is at stake is the very existence of the only being that can ask for reasons? This would make reason dependent on the irrational. And this is why I call this attitude, suicide, intellectual suicide, and even high treason, in contradistinction to the other paradox that I stumbled upon in science, which is the highest achievement of human reason in its accurate description of nature, that leads us to imagine or to believe, that reason itself is a product of something irrational. But in this case, i.e. reason being produced by the irrational, nothing is to blame. It simply so happened, and reason was not an accomplice in this this dirty genealogy, those not very dignified ancestors. But in the case that I'm trying to make here, reason would simply have let herself drop, would give up its claims at a search for good arguments. Now, another question, perhaps lying in ambush behind your question is, why should we go on? Perhaps the answer is negative. It might be better for mankind to disappear by voluntary extinction so that something different can arise. And this is something that we can hear in some cases. For instance, when people say, above mankind there is the goddess Earth, to whom they give a Greek name, Gaia. There are such people, and they have arguments. I don't say they have good arguments, but they have arguments. What I'm trying to do is to show in a merely Darwinistic way why we need religion? If religion is the necessary condition for the survival of the human species, then there is no question any longer. Irreligious people, irreligious groups will simply die out. And so my question is, what kind of religion will there be? Will we have a stupid religion? Or will we have a more enlightened one? This is, in my opinion, the real issue. Sorry to be that blunt.
We will welcome other questions, but please, if you could come to the microphone.
Yes.
And so also, if the next one can be prepared to jump in. Do we have another question? Please come here. Thank you. Yeah, sure. So I forgot to mention that questions both in French and in English are welcome.
Monsieur Brague, je suis déjà à traiter de conférences aujourd'hui, donc votre présentation sur moi fait que j'ai vraiment du mal à présenter des idées clairement. En fait, j'entrevois votre démarche comme la proposition d'un renouveau métaphysique qui, justement, est d'autant plus révolutionnaire que la métaphysique n'est pas à la mode, puis qu'on considère que ce vocabulaire-là, qu'on pourrait considérer en tant qu'athée, que ce vocabulaire-là ou ces questions-là doivent tout simplement disparaître. Et j'envisage votre démarche comme une invitation à une forme de métaphysique qui, justement, serait capable de prendre tout ce qui a été réalisé jusqu'au bout de notre civilisation, en termes de sciences et de techniques, justement, sans les jugements de valeur habituels qu'on entend, et avec une proposition, justement, que l'humanité, non seulement se légitime, mais se transcende. Quelque chose comme ça, justement, de transcender sa propre nature à travers ça. Et en fait, ce que je me demandais, tout simplement, justement, c'est que j'ai la sensation que, même si l'athéisme est moribond, comme vous me le faites espérer, où est cette parole, en fait? Où est cette parole qui appelle la transcendance, justement, de cette forme de transcendance, ce renouveau métaphysique? Où est-ce qu'on peut la trouver? C'est ça, en fait.
Thank you so much. Well, we are in an English-speaking institution. Yeah. I feel sort of compelled to answer even a question asked in French in some sort of English. Well, I would hate my giving the impression that I am preaching in favor of anything. This is not the part that a philosopher has to play. A philosopher is supposed to describe reality and to, let's say, to uncover the logic of its development. I'm simply trying to point out that the inner logic of what I call the modern project, which I could call by other names. Some historians of thought coined the phrase of exclusive humanism. Exclusive humanism, i.e., well, man is to be promoted, defended, or not, and there is nothing above man. And when I say that the inner logic of exclusive theism leads to the lack of any external reference point from an external point, the outlook of which could be positive, possibly even negative, on man, but that could be legitimate. Man's judgment on man has no worth. We don't judge a person by asking him or her, what kind of fellow do you think you are? And we will get, in any case, either a positive answer or a negative answer. If we get a negative answer, we will have to ask, well, why are you still there? If you are that bad, well, the way out is there. that's again an utterance by Seneca. I'm afraid I don't remember where he said that. The way out is everywhere. He was a lunatic, Stoic. Stoicism is, to quote a beautiful phrase by Baudelaire, the religion whose only sacrament is suicide. The religion whose only sacrament is suicide. That's quite well formulated. Well, if we admit this, we'll have, in fact, and I come back to your question, we'll have, in fact, to, well, not to plead in favor of metaphysics, but simply to show that something like a relationship to transcendence, and for this the word metaphysics might be apposite. Why shouldn't we call that metaphysics? I did that in my last booklet. But what I mean is not metaphysics as a field of philosophy, like logics, aesthetics, ethics, and so on. What I mean is this living relationship to transcendence. Well, the way we can grasp something that lies outside of the realm, outside of the human ken, and that can give the human species a prop or a ground, two senses of the word. Well, the question whether theism lies on its deathbed, well, that's a question for sociologists, and sociologists probably would say no. Would say no. I began with, playing the part of the advocatus diaboli by showing that, well, there are things that are very much to the credit of atheism, atheism understood as a neutrality towards any religious claim, and that could very well ensure a good future to atheism. What I am claiming as a philosopher, not as a sociologist, is that atheism could go further, could keep existing as long as it remains inconsequent. And I'm thinking, there's a French thinker who is now probably rightly forgotten, from the early 20th century. He was a biologist and, well, had a smattering on philosophy. His name was Le Dantec, L-E-D-A-N-T-E-C. Breton, from Britain, as the name has it. And he wrote a small book by the title of Atheism. And in this, in this book, he develops very much the same kind of argument that we have just been developing, i.e., the logical consequences of atheism is the disappearance of mankind. And he wrote that in 1907, and as a confirmed believer, as a militant atheist. And then he adds, fortunately, he doesn't say thank God, fortunately, I feel in myself, well, the inheritance of former generations that grew in Brittany, i.e., a country steeped in popular Catholicism, that give me an inheritance that gives me moral principles, and I abide by those moral principles, although I full well know that they are prejudices. Well, is such an attitude able to is it sustainable, as the idiom has it, is it sustainable in the long run? Personally, I would doubt that. But, okay, that's my opinion.
Is there another question?
I'll be able to ask the audience that.
So just to make sure your question is more or less like, why should humans continue to exist, right? So, I mean, like, I'm going to have to kind of agree with the graffiti artist there, because, like, humans, like, the Earth has been around for 4.5 billion years. Humans have been around for, like, 50,000 of those years. I mean, like, species come and go all the time. That's just how it is.
Well, let me... first, there are some biologists who claim that species have a definite lifespan.
About 1 million years.
Never mind. There's a definite lifespan, and well, it so happens that, well, if this is true, man should, human beings, human species should live on for quite a bit. That's my first point. The second point is that, well, there have been human beings for quite a long time, but we should always keep in mind that the survival of this species depends wholly on the present generation. It's totally indifferent whether there have been human beings for 1 million or 1 billion years. That's just for the sake of argument. What is important is that everything will go on if mankind reproduces itself in a span of 40 years. I mean, the whole building, the huge building of the human species rests upon a very thin needle, 40 years. And people have been cognizant of that for centuries. There's a sonnet, Shakespeare, who had this boy friend, and who encouraged him to marry, to beget children. For if not, says Shakespeare, 80 years would do the world away, something like that. There is the equivalent of that, well, in French literature, in this medieval romance, the Roman de la Rose. And, well, this is obvious. This is obvious. If we stop begetting children for 40 years, well, no woman will be left who could bear any. Okay, we'll have to call it a day. And for this reason, we should not be intoxicated by those big figures, millions of years and so on and so on. This is very true. There have been, well, holiness, sapientes, for X centuries, I don't know exactly. That's important. But everything depends on the present. To some extent, only the present is real. The past is high, and the future depends on us. Which, this is very interesting for a philosopher. Let's say, an ethical question. ethics deals with action, not with what happened in the past, only directly, that could happen in the future, or there will be a future if we decide right now. Okay, well, perhaps
what does that have to do with atheism?
Well, perhaps I should repeat my thing. If we had no good reason to beget children, i.e., let me I wanted to have something to read on the plane, and it so happened that I had never read Byron. Okay, I feel ashamed. And well, there's this. I discovered that 3 days ago. Lucifer is speaking to Cain. You know, I have to raise Cain in order to answer your question. But in this piece, Cain, a mystery that he wrote in 1821, there's a dialogue between Lucifer and Cain. And Lucifer, is debunking mankind, which is a lofty mind chained in a body made of mud and things. It's the old Gnostic and Platonic, but up to a point, theme. And he's alluding to sexual pleasure. The very best of thine enjoyments, that's sex, is a sweet degradation, a most enervating and filthy cheat to lure thee on the renewal of fresh souls and bodies, all foredoomed to be as frail and few so happy. And Cain answers, here let me, I skip some lines, here let me die, for to give birth to those who can but suffer many years and die, methinks is merely propagating death and multiplying murder. When we beget a child, we beget a mortal being. We condemn somebody to die, and we are hardly sure that the happiness that this being can enjoy can be a balanced weight to, whatever kind of torture, illness, things that he or she can suffer. And if we have not something to tip the scales in favor of being over nothingness, and this is something that I call God, but then we are not yet out of the woods, and we even are in a fun predicament. But that's an old question. 1821, 3 years after Schopenhauer's Die Welt als Vorstellung, who tried, as I told you, to show that sexual pleasure is a cheat. I was surprised when I read that. And if, let's say life as a blind force plays this kind of tricks with us, why should we go on? If we are the result of blind forces, why should we go on doing freely and rationally what produced us unfreely and irrationally?
Maybe if we cannot answer, we can still say let's eat and drink. So we all welcome you for the cheese and wine now, and we warmly thank you, Professor Brague, for your lecture.